Hello everybody, this is Johns Hopkins with Baltimore Heritage, and we're back with another of our 5-Minute Histories videos. And today I'm in East Baltimore at Ashland and Collington Avenues, and if I was here 100 years ago, the streets would have been filled with the smells of kolache, that wonderful Czech pastry, or sauerkraut, or if it was the holidays, hauska, the Czech bread made with raisins and cherries that's so delicious. And that's because the streets would have been teeming with folks from Bohemia and Moravia and Silesia, the areas in Eastern Europe that would go on to make up Czechoslovakia. In fact, this area was known as Little Bohemia for generations. And 100 years ago, the church that's behind me now would have loomed over the neighborhood and been a part of it, and that's, of course, St. Wenceslaus. Before we talk about the church, let's talk a little bit about Czechs in Baltimore. The early records are a little sketchy, at least in part because the U.S. Census Bureau didn't start marking people as Czech until 1880. We know that probably the first Czech in Baltimore was a Jewish gentleman named Jacob Bloch. One of the first Czechs that we have a little bit of information about is a gentleman named Levi Kolmus. He came from Prague in the early 1800s, fought in the War of 1812. He was a defender at the Battle of Baltimore and was an elector in Baltimore Hebrew congregation. But the big waves of immigrants didn't start coming until the 1870s and 1880s. If you were one of those folks, you probably came over through the North German Lloyd Steamship Company, got off in Locust Point, and probably spent some time in Fells Point on Thames Street or Ann Street. As Baltimore's Bohemian population grew, folks started moving northward along Broadway, probably working in canneries or factories like that, or as tailors. In fact, one of a block on Broadway had so many Czech tailors that it was called Tailor Row. And if you were one of those folks, you no doubt socialized at a place called Shimmick's Hall on Broadway. Today it's a Baptist church. It's still there. And you maybe went to an event that was a popular one, and let me get the name right, called Shipvensky, which was a masked ball. You would get there at 7 or 8 at night in costume and dance the night away until dawn. Once you got your feet on the ground, you maybe got a loan from one of the 20 or so Bohemian building and loan associations that would lend money where Main Street banks would not in immigrant communities like the one that was here. And if you were really lucky, you got to buy a new house built likely by a gentleman named Frank Novak, himself Bohemian. He was known as the two-story king of Baltimore. In his prodigious career, he built over 7,000 two-story brick row houses with marble steps. Really impressive there. By the 1870s, there were about 1,000 Bohemians here in the city, but they didn't have a dedicated church. There was a priest out of St. Alphonsus, John Berger, who was himself Bohemian, who was a part-time minister, but he soon realized that the community needed a full-time minister, and he went ahead and was able to secure the first full-time Bohemian priest, a gentleman named Wendell Vacula. By 1872, the congregation had grown to several thousand, and they purchased a former Lutheran church at Central in Baltimore and dedicated it to the 10th century martyr and patron saint of the Czech state, and that, of course, is King Wenceslaus, who incidentally is also the same King Wenceslaus as in the holiday carol that's traditionally sung on St. Stephen's Day, December 26th. Things were going well during that first, say, 10 years or so. The congregation at St. Wenceslaus was made up of Bohemians and also Poles and Lithuanians, and that caused some friction. In fact, it caused so much friction that in 1882, Baltimore's Archbishop Gibbons felt the need to write to the Redemptorist order in Austria, begging for a priest. Here's what he wrote. "I beg of you, in the interest of charity and religion, and to prevent the constant trouble, to comply with my request by sending a priest who will assume charge of the Bohemian Church in Baltimore. We will never have permanent peace until your fathers have control of the parish." Archbishop Gibbons's request was granted, and a priest named John Gents came over from Bohemia as a full-time pastor to a congregation that now numbered 5,000. The church continued to grow, excuse me, and moved to a new former Universalist place in the 1880s. on Central Avenue. And then by 1900, a number of the social organizations at the church pooled resources and bought a lot here at Ashland and Collington to build a new church. They started out building a school, which was run by the School Sisters of Notre Dame, that also acted as a temporary church, while they raised the $150,000 needed to build this one. By 1914, they had done that, and in 1915, Archbishop Gibbons comes back to dedicate the church and with the congregation of St. Wenceslaus. If you're wondering, the style is a wonderful Romanesque Byzantine, I guess, is what it would be. And a 1970s article, the Baltimore Sun said it, quote, "The church stands like a cathedral in a village of two-story row houses." And I think that's a pretty apt description. Over the last 110 years or so that the church has been here, it's seen a lot of changes. A lot of its young men went off to fight in World War I and World War II. In 1958, it became one of the first churches in Baltimore to get central air conditioning. In 1968, it had a front row seat to the Martin Luther King riots. And in the 1970s and 80s, it saw its parishioners move out and its neighbors change from predominantly European Americans to predominantly Black Americans. And today, there are weekly services now done by the Josephite order, no longer the Redemptorists, but there are weekly services and a lot of ministries, including a very active soup kitchen. So I'm going to wrap up and say the next time you're in East Baltimore, make a point to swing by, take a look at the church, take a look at one of the Bohemian houses across the street that belonged to a gentleman named William Octavek, who in 1913 painted his little grocery store screen door with fruits and vegetables, becoming the first Baltimore screen painter. We did a video on that. But swing by and say a thanks to the Octaveks and screen painting, but say a even bigger thanks maybe to the folks at St. Wenceslaus, who for 150 years have carried on a strong Bohemian tradition and culture here in East Baltimore. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.